She was 11 years old. It was a bright California summer afternoon. And she was walking home. That was all it took. One moment she was there, a little girl moving through a neighborhood that felt as safe as anywhere on earth. The next moment, a turquoise van pulled up beside her. Words were exchanged. And then, in the span of a single minute, she was gone. Vanished from the sidewalk, vanished from the street, vanished from the life her parents had spent every waking hour building around her. By the time the sun rose the following morning, Linda O'Keefe's body had been recovered from a marsh 3 miles away. 3 miles from her home. 3 miles from her mother. 3 miles from everything she had ever known. The van was gone. The man who drove it was gone. And for the next 48 years, he would stay gone, hiding in plain sight under a stolen identity, in another state, surrounded by people who had no idea who he really was or what he had done on a July afternoon in 1973. This is the story of a little girl who deserved better. This is the story of a family that never gave up. This is the story of how science, decades later, reached back through time and dragged a killer out of the shadows he thought would protect him forever. You are watching Coldcase Crimelab. And tonight, we reopen the case of Linda O'Keefe. Before we go any further, if you are new here, welcome to Coldcase Crimelab. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because we cover the cases that the world forgot but justice never should. Like this video if you believe every victim deserves a name, a story, and an answer. And drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from tonight, because this community spans the entire world and every single one of you matters. Now, let's get into it. To understand what happened to Linda O'Keefe, you have to understand the world she lived in. You have to understand the time, the place, and the feeling, because the feeling matters. The feeling is part of what makes this story so devastating. It was 1973. The United States was a country in the middle of a particular kind of shift. The Vietnam War was winding down. Watergate was beginning to unravel. The cultural upheavals of the 1960s had given way to something quieter, something more uncertain, a nation collectively exhaling and trying to figure out what came next. People were tired of chaos. People were tired of upheaval. And in the small coastal communities dotting the Southern California shoreline, people were holding tightly to the idea that life could still be simple. Life could still be safe. Life could still be good. Newport Beach was exactly that kind of place. Sit with that image for a moment. Newport Beach in the summer of 1973. The Pacific Ocean stretching out to the west, vast and blue and endless. The sky above it cloudless and warm, the kind of deep California blue that seems almost unreal, almost like a painting, like something a person might describe to someone who had never been there and struggled to make them truly understand. The air carried salt and warmth and the distant sound of seagulls riding the coastal thermals, wheeling lazily above the water with no particular urgency, no particular destination. This was a community built on a certain idea of life. A slower idea. A quieter one. Streets lined with palm trees casting long afternoon shadows across sidewalks where children played freely, where neighbors waved to one another over garden fences, where the rhythm of days was measured not by deadlines or disasters but by the movement of the tide and the shifting angle of the sun. In 1973, Newport Beach was the kind of place where parents sent their children outside after breakfast and didn't expect to see them again until dinner. Not because they were careless. Because they believed in the safety of their world. Because nothing had yet given them a reason not to. Doors were left unlocked. Windows stayed open through the night to catch the sea breeze. Children rode their bicycles for miles without anyone worrying, without anyone tracking their location, without anyone feeling the cold edge of fear that parents in later decades would come to know as an ordinary, constant companion. Newport Beach was not a city of suspicion. It was a city of trust. And that trust, that beautiful and terrible trust, is part of what made the summer of 1973 so easy for a predator to exploit. Within Newport Beach sat the neighborhood of Corona del March. The name itself translates from Spanish as Crown of the Sea, and it wore that name with a quiet pride. Corona del Mar was a residential enclave of tidy streets and modest homes, of small neighborhood parks where children gathered after school, of gardens tended with care by people who took pride in their corner of this already beautiful place. The sea breeze moved through the neighborhood at all hours, carrying with it that particular coastal perfume of salt and eucalyptus and sun-baked earth that anyone who has lived near the California coast will recognize immediately and carry with them for the rest of their life no matter where they go. On a street called Galaxy Drive, the O'Keefe family had made their home. Richard O'Keefe was the kind of man that communities are quietly built around. He was a machinist by trade, a man who worked with his hands, who understood the precision required to make things function correctly, who brought that same steadiness and dependability to every dimension of his life. Richard O'Keefe was not a man who made grand gestures or demanded attention. He was a man who showed up. Every single day, in every single way, he showed up for his family. He went to work. He came home. He was present in the way that truly good fathers are present, not just physically in the room, but genuinely, attentively, completely there. His wife Barbara was something of an artist, though she might never have used that word to describe herself. She was a seamstress, working from home with a skill and a sensitivity that went far beyond mere technical competence. Barbara O'Keefe had a creative touch. She designed clothes, designed them, not simply assembled them, and her greatest joy was creating pieces for her daughter. Simple dresses, mostly. Nothing elaborate. But in every one of them, in every carefully chosen fabric and every precisely placed stitch, there was something that could not be manufactured or replicated. There was love. The specific, irreplaceable love of a mother who wanted her child to move through the world feeling beautiful, feeling seen, feeling cared for in a way that went all the way down to the clothes on her back. Their daughter was Linda. Linda O'Keefe was 11 years old in the summer of 1973, and she was exactly the kind of child that a neighborhood like Corona del Mar seemed designed to produce. She was bright and curious and completely at home in the world around her. She knew her neighbors. She knew the streets. She had the easy confidence of a child who has been loved well and consistently, who has been given every reason to believe that the world is a fundamentally safe and welcoming place. She rode her bicycle. She played with friends. She moved through her days with the particular freedom that children of that era in communities like that one enjoyed as a simple, unquestioned fact of life. Linda O'Keefe had no reason to be afraid. And that is the thing that will sit with you long after this story is over. She had no reason to be afraid. She was doing exactly what children in that neighborhood did every single day. She was living her life in the only way she knew how to live it. She was trusting in the safety of her world the way her parents trusted it, the way her neighbors trusted it, the way an entire community had built its daily existence on the foundation of that trust. She had no reason to be afraid. And she still ended up dead. July 6, 1973. It was a Friday. The kind of Friday that arrives in the middle of summer vacation with no particular agenda, no particular demands, just the open expanse of another warm California day waiting to be filled with whatever an 11-year-old girl might choose to do with it. School was out. The summer was long. The afternoon was golden. Linda O'Keefe left her home on Galaxy Drive sometime in the early afternoon. The precise details of where she was going have been reported slightly differently across various accounts over the decades, but the essential truth is simple: she was doing what children in that neighborhood did. She was going somewhere nearby. She was moving through her world without fear. She was 11 years old and the summer was beautiful and she had every reason to believe she would be home for dinner. She had done this before. She would do it again. Except she never came home. The hours passed. The afternoon light shifted and deepened into the particular gold of a California evening, that long slow fade that makes everything look warmer and more beautiful than it has any right to look. And Linda O'Keefe did not walk through the front door. She did not appear at the end of the street. She did not call out to her mother or drop her bicycle against the side of the house or do any of the small ordinary things that mark a child's return at the end of a day. She simply was not there. Richard and Barbara O'Keefe began to worry with the specific, escalating terror that only parents know, that first flicker of unease that you try to dismiss, that grows into real concern, that tips over into something that no parent ever wants to feel. They began to ask. They began to look. They began to reach out to friends and neighbors and anyone who might have seen their daughter, who might know where she had gone, who might be able to offer some small reassurance that she was simply at a friend's house and had lost track of time the way children do. But the reassurance did not come. What came instead were witnesses. People in the neighborhood who had seen something that afternoon. Something that, in the moment, had perhaps not seemed alarming. But in the context of a missing child, in the context of an 11-year-old girl who had not come home, it took on a weight and a darkness that no one wanted to confront. Witnesses had seen Linda O'Keefe talking to a man. The man was in a van. A turquoise van, that specific, distinctive color that witnesses would remember clearly and consistently, that would become one of the defining details of this case, that would echo through decades of investigation and public appeals and cold case reviews. A turquoise van, parked or slowed on a street in Corona del Mar, with a man inside it engaging a young girl in conversation. The conversation had not lasted long. Within minutes, some accounts say within a single minute, both Linda and the van were gone. That was all anyone saw. That was the totality of the witness evidence from that afternoon. A turquoise van. A brief exchange of words. And then nothing. Nothing but absence. The Newport Beach Police Department was notified. A search began. The kind of search that tears through a community like a storm, that mobilizes neighbors and officers and volunteers, that fills the streets with flashlights and urgency and the desperate hope that the next turn, the next call, the next piece of information will be the one that leads to a frightened but living child. But Linda O'Keefe was not found that night. She was found the next morning. July 7, 1973. By sunrise, searchers had located the body of Linda O'Keefe in a marsh approximately 3 miles from her home. 3 miles from Galaxy Drive. 3 miles from the mother who had sewn her dresses with love in every stitch. 3 miles from the father who showed up for his family every single day. She was gone. She was 11 years old, and she was gone, and the man who had taken her was already somewhere else. The turquoise van had dissolved into the California landscape as completely as if it had never existed. The man behind it will have become a ghost, present enough to destroy a family, invisible enough to escape every consequence. The Newport Beach Police Department opened a murder investigation. Detectives began the painstaking work of trying to reconstruct the last hours of Linda O'Keefe's life, trying to identify the man in the turquoise van, trying to pull from the community every scrap of information that might give them a thread to follow. The thread, when it came, was impossibly thin. Witnesses could describe the van. Turquoise, as noted. A certain size, a certain approximate age. But the details were the details of a passing observation, not the details of someone who had known they were watching a crime in progress. In 1973, there were no surveillance cameras on street corners recording everything in high definition for later review. There was no automatic license plate recognition. There was no digital trail of any kind. There was only human memory, and human memory, even at its sharpest, has its limits. The man himself was even harder to pin down. Descriptions were approximate. A white male, adult, but beyond that the specifics blurred and shifted in the way that eyewitness accounts of brief, unexpected encounters so often do. No one had thought to memorize his face. No one had thought to note his license plate. Why would they? He was just a man in a van, talking to a child on a sunny afternoon. Nothing about that moment had announced itself as the kind of moment that needed to be recorded and preserved and reported. Until it was too late. Detectives worked the case hard in those early weeks and months. They canvassed the neighborhood. They followed every lead. They appealed to the public for information. They pursued every turquoise van they could find, every registered owner, every possible connection to the Newport Beach area. They did everything that investigators in 1973 had the tools and the knowledge to do. And still the man in the turquoise van remained a ghost. The months passed. The investigation continued, but the pace of it slowed the way all investigations slow when the leads dry up and the witnesses have been interviewed and the evidence has been examined and still no answer has emerged. The case did not close. Newport Beach detectives are adamant about that. The case of Linda O'Keefe never officially closed. It was carried forward, year after year, by investigators who refused to let it become just another cold case statistic, just another manila folder gathering dust in a filing cabinet. But the years passed anyway. 1973 became 1974. 1974 became 1975. The decade turned. Ronald Reagan was elected governor of California. The bicentennial came and went. Disco rose and fell. The 1980s arrived with their own concerns, their own crises, their own preoccupations, and Linda O'Keefe's case moved further and further into the past while the man who killed her moved further and further into a life that had no room for accountability. He was out there. Living. Breathing. Moving through his days as if nothing had happened. As if a little girl's life was not the price of his freedom. As if a family's grief was not the foundation on which his continued existence was built. He was out there, and he was hiding, and for decade after decade, no one could find him. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now with the words "I'm still here." Let's see who is truly following this story, because what comes next is where everything changes. This is where science steps in. This is where the cold case gets warm again. This is where 48 years of hiding comes to an end. To understand how Gary Ramirez was eventually identified and arrested, you have to understand the evolution of forensic science over the decades that followed Linda O'Keefe's murder. Because the tools that finally caught him did not exist in 1973. They barely existed 20 years after that. The science that brought Linda's killer to justice was science that had to be invented, refined, perfected, and deployed by a new generation of investigators who were willing to look at old cases with completely new eyes. In 1973, forensic science was a fundamentally different discipline than it is today. DNA analysis as we understand it did not yet exist. The structure of DNA had been described by Watson and Crick in 1953, but the application of DNA science to criminal investigation was still decades away. In 1973, investigators working a crime scene collected physical evidence, fibers, fingerprints, hair samples, bodily fluids, and processed that evidence using the techniques available to them. Those techniques were not nothing. They could establish certain facts, eliminate certain suspects, point investigators in certain directions. But they could not do what we now take for granted. They could not look at a microscopic sample of biological material and extract from it a unique genetic signature that could be matched to an individual with near absolute certainty. That capability would not arrive until the mid-1980s, when a British geneticist named Alec Jeffreys developed the first DNA profiling techniques. The technology was initially used in immigration cases before its first criminal application in the United Kingdom in 1986. It crossed the Atlantic shortly after, and by the late 1980s and early 1990s, DNA evidence was beginning to reshape criminal investigation in the United States in ways that were genuinely revolutionary. For cold cases like Linda O'Keefe's, this was both a gift and a source of complicated hope. A gift because it meant that biological evidence collected at crime scenes decades earlier could potentially now be analyzed in ways that had been impossible at the time of collection. A source of complicated hope because the value of that evidence depended entirely on whether it had been properly preserved, whether enough of it remained after decades of storage, and whether there was any viable suspect to match it against. In the case of Linda O'Keefe, investigators had DNA evidence. Evidence collected in 1973, preserved through the intervening decades, and eventually analyzed using the more advanced techniques that became available as the science progressed. A DNA profile was developed from that evidence, a genetic fingerprint belonging to the man who had killed Linda O'Keefe. But a DNA profile is only useful if there is a database to check it against, a suspect to compare it to, or a methodology for using it to identify an unknown individual. And for years, despite having that profile, investigators could not find a match. The man in the turquoise van was not in any criminal database. He had apparently never been convicted of any crime that had led to his DNA being collected and catalogued. He had managed, somehow, to move through the decades without ever appearing in any of the systems that might have flagged him. He was hidden. Effectively, completely, maddeningly hidden. And then the science evolved again. Genetic genealogy is a technique that uses DNA analysis not simply to identify a known individual but to identify unknown individuals through their biological relatives. The principle is elegant in its logic: every person shares genetic material with their family members. Parents, children, siblings share the most. Cousins, aunts, uncles, more distant relations share progressively less, but still enough to be detectable with sufficiently sensitive analysis. If an unidentified DNA sample can be uploaded to a database of consumer genetic profiles, the kind of profiles created by millions of people who have sent their saliva to companies like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe to learn about their heritage, it becomes possible to identify biological relatives of the unknown individual even if that individual themselves has never had their DNA tested. From those relatives, working with the same genealogical research techniques used by family history enthusiasts around the world, investigators can build family trees. They can trace the branches of a genetic family, following the DNA evidence across generations, eliminating individuals who do not fit the demographic profile of their suspect, narrowing the field progressively until a manageable list of candidates emerges. From that list, conventional investigative techniques, surveillance, discarded DNA samples, public records, can confirm or eliminate each candidate until only one remains. It sounds, described in those terms, almost simple. It is not simple. It requires sophisticated genetic analysis, deep genealogical expertise, careful investigative work, and a significant investment of time and resources. But it works. It has been proven to work in case after case where every other investigative avenue had been exhausted. The most famous example, the one that made the technique a household term, was the identification of the Golden State Killer. Joseph James DeAngelo had committed a series of rapes and murders across California in the 1970s and 1980s, evading identification for decades despite being one of the most intensively investigated criminals in American history. In 2018, investigators used genetic genealogy to trace his DNA to his biological relatives, build a family tree, and identify him as the prime suspect. A DNA sample collected covertly from DeAngelo confirmed the match. He was arrested within days. The Golden State Killer case changed everything. It demonstrated conclusively that genetic genealogy could solve cold cases that had resisted every other investigative approach. It inspired investigators across the country to look at their own cold cases with new eyes and ask a simple but transformative question: do we have DNA evidence, and if we do, can we use this technique? In Newport Beach, the answer to both questions was yes. Investigators working the Linda O'Keefe case began the process of applying genetic genealogy to their existing DNA evidence. The work was meticulous and painstaking, the kind of work that does not lend itself to dramatic television reconstructions because so much of it takes place at computer screens and in genealogical databases rather than at crime scenes or in interrogation rooms. But the work proceeded. Family trees were built. Branches were traced. Individuals were identified and investigated and eliminated, one by one, until the investigation converged on a name. A name attached to a man living in another state. A man living under an identity that was not his original one. A man who had spent nearly half a century making himself invisible. His name was Gary Ramirez. Or rather, that was the name he had been using. The name he had built his post-murder life around. The name attached to his address, his neighbors, his daily existence in Arizona. He had constructed a parallel identity with the care and deliberateness of someone who understood that the alternative was accountability for what he had done on a July afternoon in 1973 in a quiet neighborhood by the California coast. He had reinvented himself. He had become someone else. And for decades, it had worked. It is worth pausing here to consider what that means. Not just as a fact of the investigation, but as a human reality. For 48 years, a man walked around knowing what he had done. Knowing that somewhere in California, a family was living with the wound he had made in them. Knowing that a little girl's mother had buried her daughter and carried that grief through every single day of the decades that followed. Knowing that investigators were still looking, still working, still trying to find him. And he simply did not care. That is the only possible conclusion. The decision to take on a false identity, to move to another state, to build an entire constructed life around the fiction that he was someone other than who he truly was, that decision was not made in a moment of panic. It was not a spontaneous reaction. It was a calculated, sustained, deliberately maintained choice. A choice that required daily renewal. A choice that meant looking in the mirror every morning and choosing, again, to be the person who got away with murdering an 11-year-old girl. He made that choice for 48 years. And then, in 2021, investigators came for him. The arrest of Gary Ramirez did not unfold the way arrests do in the movies. There was no dramatic chase. No standoff. No moment of cinematic confrontation in which a killer is finally made to face the enormity of what he has done. There was investigative work, carefully conducted over time, leading to the quiet, inevitable moment when law enforcement officers appeared at the door of a man in Arizona who thought he had successfully become someone else. The DNA evidence was confirmed. The genetic genealogy work had led investigators to the right place, to the right man. The biological evidence collected from the crime scene in 1973 matched the DNA of Gary Ramirez with the kind of certainty that leaves no room for reasonable doubt. He was the man in the turquoise van. He was the man who had taken Linda O'Keefe from a sidewalk in Corona del Mar on a July afternoon. He was the man who had driven 3 miles to a marsh and left an 11-year-old girl there and driven away and spent the next 4.5 decades pretending to be someone else. Science had found him. Science had found him hiding inside an assumed identity in another state, surrounded by people who did not know who he was, living a life built on the foundation of an unspeakable act and the assumption that he was clever enough, careful enough, distant enough, different enough to escape the consequences of it forever. He was not. The arrest of Gary Ramirez sent a wave through the Newport Beach community and through the broader world of cold case investigation that was simultaneously devastating and profound. Devastating because the arrest meant confronting, again, the reality of what had been done to Linda O'Keefe. Profound because it demonstrated something genuinely important about the nature of justice and the power of perseverance. Justice is not always swift. This is one of the hardest truths about the world, one that sits in direct and uncomfortable contradiction with our deep, almost instinctive need to believe that wrongs are corrected quickly, that the scales balance themselves within a timeframe that feels proportionate to the harm caused. We want to believe that a person who murders an 11-year-old girl will be caught within days or weeks, tried and convicted within months, made to face the consequences of their actions before the grief of those consequences has had time to calcify into the permanent scar tissue of unresolved loss. The reality is frequently different. And the case of Linda O'Keefe is one of the starkest illustrations of that reality that the modern era of cold case investigation has produced. 48 years. Think about what 48 years means. Think about what the O'Keefe family carried through those 48 years. Richard and Barbara O'Keefe, the machinist and the seamstress, the father who showed up every day and the mother who sewed love into every stitch, they lived with the absence of their daughter for every single one of those 48 years. Every birthday Linda did not have. Every Christmas, every summer, every ordinary Tuesday that passed without her. They carried it all. They carried the specific, unending grief of parents who lost a child to violence and never received the answer of why, or who, or how it was possible that someone could do such a thing and simply disappear. And they were not alone in what they carried. The community of Corona del Mar carried it too. The neighbors who had known Linda, who had seen her riding her bicycle on Galaxy Drive, who had perhaps exchanged words with her on the afternoon she disappeared, they carried the particular weight of a community that has been violated, that has had its sense of safety stripped away, that has learned in the most brutal possible way that trust and innocence are not the same thing as protection. Newport Beach changed after Linda O'Keefe. The change was not dramatic or immediate. The city did not transform overnight into a place of locked doors and fearful children, because human communities are resilient and because the alternative, living every day in the paralysis of fear, is not really living at all. But something shifted. Something in the community's relationship to its own sense of safety was permanently, quietly altered. Parents watched their children a little more closely. The carefree freedom that had characterized summer afternoons in Corona del Mar was subtly, irrevocably different. The investigation, too, changed things. Not just in Newport Beach, but in the broader world of criminal investigation. The case of Linda O'Keefe became, in the years following Gary Ramirez's arrest, something of a landmark in the story of how genetic genealogy transformed cold case work. It joined a growing catalog of cases in which DNA evidence that had sat in storage for decades, seemingly exhausted of its investigative potential, had been given new life by a technique that nobody had imagined when the evidence was originally collected. This is the thing that the story of Linda O'Keefe teaches us about science, if we are paying attention. Science does not have a fixed endpoint. The tools available to investigators in any given year are not the final tools that will ever exist. Every decade brings new capabilities, new techniques, new ways of extracting information from evidence that previously seemed to have given up everything it had to give. Evidence preserved carefully and kept alive through years of cold case investigation does not become worthless with the passage of time. It waits. It waits for the science to catch up to the question it contains. The DNA evidence from Linda O'Keefe's case waited 48 years for science to catch up to it. And when the science arrived, it delivered an answer. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, something extraordinary. It is a demonstration that the careful, unglamorous, often thankless work of maintaining cold case investigations, of keeping the files updated and the evidence preserved and the institutional memory of what happened alive through staff changes and budget cuts and the simple erosion of time, is work that matters. Work that can, given the right circumstances and the right scientific development at the right moment, change everything. The investigators who worked the Linda O'Keefe case over the decades did not know that genetic genealogy was coming. They could not have known. But they kept the evidence. They kept the case alive. They kept asking the question that needed to be answered. And when the science arrived that could finally answer it, they were ready. That readiness, that sustained, patient, committed readiness, is why Gary Ramirez was arrested in 2021 rather than dying in Arizona still wearing someone else's name. It is worth spending some time with the specifics of how genetic genealogy actually works in a case like this, because the science is genuinely fascinating and because understanding it helps illuminate both the power and the complexity of this investigative technique. When investigators decided to apply genetic genealogy to the Linda O'Keefe case, they began with the DNA profile that had already been developed from the crime scene evidence. This profile, a genetic fingerprint unique to the unknown male who had killed Linda, was their starting point. In the language of genetic genealogy, this profile belonged to an unknown individual often referred to in investigative contexts as an unknown subject or simply the unknown. The first step was to upload this profile to one of the consumer genealogy databases that allow law enforcement to search for familial matches. GEDmatch was one of the earliest and most widely used of these databases for forensic purposes. It is the same database that played a crucial role in identifying the Golden State Killer. The database contains millions of genetic profiles uploaded by ordinary people who have had their DNA tested through consumer services and chosen to share their results. When an unknown forensic profile is uploaded and compared against those millions of profiles, the results show not exact matches, unless the unknown individual themselves has been tested, but partial matches indicating shared genetic material with biological relatives. These partial matches are the starting point for the genealogical work that follows. Each partial match represents a relative of the unknown individual, perhaps a cousin, perhaps a second cousin, perhaps a more distant relation. The degree of shared DNA indicates roughly how closely related that person is to the unknown subject. Close relatives share more DNA. Distant relatives share less. The genealogists who work these cases, and it is important to note that this is specialized, skilled work requiring years of training and experience, begin building family trees from these partial matches. They use publicly available records, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage records, census data, newspaper archives, genealogical databases, and anything else that helps them construct the family structures connecting these genetic relatives to one another and, ultimately, to the unknown subject. It is painstaking work. A single investigation can require the construction of dozens of family trees, each one potentially containing hundreds of individuals, each one representing hours of research and verification. The genealogists must be systematic and rigorous, because errors in this work can send an investigation in the wrong direction and waste precious time and resources. As the family trees take shape, the investigators begin the process of elimination. They know certain things about their unknown subject from the crime scene evidence and the original investigation. In the case of Linda O'Keefe, they knew they were looking for a white male who had been an adult in 1973, which meant he was born no later than the mid-1950s and possibly considerably earlier. They knew the general geographic area where he had been active. These known parameters allow them to narrow the field, eliminating individuals from the family trees who are the wrong gender, the wrong age, the wrong ethnicity, or who can be placed in a different part of the country at the time of the crime. This process of progressive elimination narrows the field of candidates from hundreds to dozens to a handful. At that point, conventional investigative techniques take over. Investigators put the remaining candidates under surveillance. They collect discarded DNA samples, a coffee cup left on a table, a cigarette but dropped on a sidewalk, and use those samples to test whether the candidate's DNA matches the forensic profile from the crime scene. When the match is confirmed, the investigation moves toward arrest. This is, at a high level, how Gary Ramirez was identified. The details of exactly which database matches led investigators to which branch of which family tree, which genealogical research led them to which candidates, how long the process took from beginning to end, many of these specifics have not been made fully public, as is often the case with ongoing prosecutions where investigative methods must be protected. But the broad outline is clear: genetic genealogy worked exactly as it had been designed to work, and it delivered an answer that 4.5 decades of conventional investigation had been unable to provide. The identification of Gary Ramirez also raises important questions that the scientific and legal communities are still actively working through. Genetic genealogy is a powerful tool, but it is not without its complications. The databases it relies on consist of profiles uploaded by people who consented to have their own DNA analyzed and potentially shared, but those people did not consent on behalf of their relatives, whose genetic information is implicitly revealed whenever a familial match is identified. This has raised legitimate privacy concerns that researchers, ethicists, lawmakers, and courts are continuing to grapple with. There are also questions about the standards and safeguards that should govern the use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigation, about who should have access to consumer genetic databases and under what circumstances, about how to balance the compelling public interest in solving violent crimes against the equally compelling interest in protecting genetic privacy. These are not simple questions, and the legal and ethical frameworks for answering them are still being developed. None of this changes what the science accomplished in the case of Linda O'Keefe. A killer who had hidden for 48 years was found. A family that had waited 4.5 decades for an answer finally received one. And the investigative technique that made it possible has now been used in hundreds of cases across the United States, bringing closure to families who had all but given up hope that anyone would ever be held accountable for what had been done to the people they loved. Let us return, for a moment, to Linda herself. Because in the sweep of this story, the decades of investigation, the evolution of forensic science, the eventual arrest, it is easy to lose sight of the child at its center. And losing sight of her would be a disservice to her memory and to the family that has carried her with them through more than 4 decades of grief and waiting. Linda O'Keefe was 11 years old. She was in that particular space of childhood that sits right on the edge of something else, old enough to have developed a personality, a sense of humor, opinions and preferences, and the beginning of an identity that was distinctly, recognizably her own. Old enough that the people who loved her knew her. They knew who she was becoming. They knew the specific texture of her laugh and the things that made her curious and the ways she was different from every other child they had ever known. And young enough that so much of what she might have become was still entirely ahead of her. The friendships she would have made in middle school and high school. The things she would have discovered she was passionate about. The person she would have fallen in love with. The life she would have built. All of it was still possible on the morning of July 6, 1973. All of it was foreclosed by nightfall. Linda O'Keefe never got to be a teenager. She never got to be a young woman. She never got to sit at a table at Thanksgiving surrounded by people she had chosen, people who loved her back, and feel the particular satisfaction of a life being built the way she wanted to build it. She never got to grow old. She never got to look back on a long life and feel the complex mixture of pride and regret and gratitude and wonder that comes with the perspective of years. She got 11 summers. 11 Christmases. 11 years of her mother's love sewn into the fabric of simple dresses. And then she got a Friday afternoon in July, and a turquoise van, and a man who had no right to take any of it from her but took it anyway. This is the thing that cold case investigations can sometimes obscure, not through any failure of intention but simply through the nature of investigation itself. When a case has been cold for decades, when the focus has shifted to forensic evidence and genetic databases and family trees and legal proceedings, the victim can begin to feel like an abstraction. A case number. A set of evidence. A name attached to a set of facts. And the investigation becomes, necessarily, about those facts and that evidence and those legal proceedings. But Linda O'Keefe was not an abstraction. She was a child who woke up on a July morning in a house on Galaxy Drive in Corona del Mar and ate breakfast and talked to her mother and went outside into a California summer day with no idea that she would not be coming back. She was a specific, irreplaceable human being with a specific, irreplaceable life, and that life was taken from her before it had the chance to become everything it might have been. Remember that. Whatever else this story is about, the science, the investigation, the eventual arrest, the decades of waiting, it is first and most fundamentally about that. About a child. About what was taken from her. About what was taken from her family. About the particular, irreversible nature of the harm that Gary Ramirez did on that July afternoon, and the fact that no arrest, no prosecution, no legal proceeding, however just, can give back what was lost. For Barbara O'Keefe, the arrest of Gary Ramirez in 2021 came after nearly 5 decades of waiting. 5 decades of living with the knowledge of what had happened to her daughter and the absence of any answer about who was responsible. 5 decades of grief layered on top of grief, of anniversaries and birthdays and the particular cruelty of a world that keeps moving forward while a part of you is frozen in a July afternoon in 1973. She had sewn dresses for her daughter. She had put love into every stitch. And then her daughter was gone, and the man who took her was gone, and for 48 years, the question of who he was remained unanswered. The arrest did not bring Linda back. Nothing could do that. But it brought something. It brought a name. It brought accountability, or at least the beginning of it. It brought the end of the chapter in which the man who killed Linda O'Keefe got to walk around pretending to be someone else, pretending that what he had done had no consequences, pretending that the world was the kind of place where a person could murder a child and simply disappear into a new identity and live out the rest of their days in unremarkable freedom. He was wrong about that. And 48 years later, he was shown to be wrong about it in a way that could not be disputed or denied. The legal proceedings that followed Gary Ramirez's arrest moved through the California court system with the pace that all such proceedings require. He faced charges of first-degree murder. The evidence against him, the DNA evidence from the original crime scene, confirmed by the genetic genealogy work that had identified him and the covert DNA collection that had confirmed the match, was powerful. The case against him was not built on eyewitness memory or circumstantial inference but on the irreducible biological reality of his own genetic material placing him at the scene of Linda O'Keefe's murder. Gary Ramirez was convicted. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. For the family of Linda O'Keefe, the verdict and the sentence were a form of justice that had been a very long time coming. Not the justice of a world in which Linda O'Keefe had been allowed to grow up and live her life. Not the justice of consequences delivered swiftly enough to have spared her family decades of unanswered grief. But justice nonetheless. The specific, imperfect, necessary justice of a legal system that exists precisely for moments like this one, to stand between the powerful and the powerless, to say that what was done was wrong, to impose consequences on the person who did it. It was not everything. It never could have been everything. But it was something real, something meaningful, something that mattered. The case of Linda O'Keefe did not exist in isolation. It was one case among many, one story within a much larger and darker story about the vulnerability of children, about the predators who exploit that vulnerability, and about what happens when a society decides that some crimes, no matter how old, deserve to be solved. In the 1970s, before the transformation in forensic science capabilities, before the advent of DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, before the construction of national criminal databases, crimes like the murder of Linda O'Keefe were extraordinarily difficult to solve unless investigators were fortunate enough to have strong witnesses, physical evidence that could be linked to a suspect through the techniques available at the time, or a perpetrator who made mistakes that led investigators directly to him. Many perpetrators made no such mistakes. Many walked free for the rest of their lives, carrying their crimes with them, occasionally becoming someone's suspicion or rumor but never being definitively identified and brought to justice. The 1970s in the United States were, in retrospect, a particularly dangerous period for children and young women. Serial killers and predatory criminals operated with a freedom that would be significantly curtailed by the technological advances of subsequent decades. Ted Bundy operated throughout the early and mid-1970s. John Wayne Gacy committed his murders between 1972 and 1978. The Hillside Stranglers were active in California in the late 1970s. It was a period when the tools available to law enforcement lagged significantly behind the mobility and sophistication of those who meant to do harm, and the gaps in those tools cost lives. Linda O'Keefe was one of the lives those gaps cost. Not because investigators failed her, they did not fail her, they worked her case with persistence and dedication over decades, but because the science that would eventually provide her family with an answer simply did not yet exist. The gap was not in effort or intention. It was in technology. And technology, ultimately, was what closed it. The broader implications of this are significant for how we think about cold cases and cold case investigation. Every unsolved murder case from the era before DNA analysis potentially contains biological evidence that could, if properly preserved, be subjected to genetic genealogy analysis today. The backlog of such cases in the United States is enormous, tens of thousands of unsolved murders, many of them predating the forensic tools that might now make them solvable. The question of how to prioritize that backlog, how to allocate the resources required to work through it systematically, and how to ensure that the evidence in those old cases has been properly preserved and is still viable for modern analysis is one of the most significant challenges facing cold case investigation in the contemporary era. The Linda O'Keefe case demonstrates both the potential and the requirements. The potential, cases that have been cold for half a century can be solved. The requirements, the evidence must have been preserved, the investigative commitment must have been sustained, and the resources must be available to apply modern techniques when they become available. Not every cold case will be solvable. Not every piece of biological evidence from a 1970s crime scene will have survived in a condition viable for modern analysis. Not every case will have the strong enough DNA profile necessary for genetic genealogy to produce useful results. But many will. And in those cases, justice that seemed permanently foreclosed by the passage of time remains possible. This is the promise that the Linda O'Keefe case holds out to other families sitting with their own unanswered questions, their own decades of waiting, their own grief. Not a guarantee. Not a certainty. But a genuine, demonstrated possibility that the science that did not exist when their loved one was taken may now exist, or may exist tomorrow, or may exist in 5 years when the next breakthrough comes. Do not give up. That is what this case says to those families. Do not give up, because the science has not given up, and the investigators have not given up, and the world has not forgotten even when it seems like the world has moved on. There is another dimension to this story that deserves attention, and it is the dimension that involves the question of identity, specifically, the false identity that Gary Ramirez constructed and maintained for decades after Linda O'Keefe's murder. The details of exactly how he did this are not fully public, for reasons that include both the ongoing nature of legal proceedings and the reasonable investigative interest in not providing a detailed roadmap for others who might seek to do the same. But the broad contours are known. He left California, traveled to another state, and assumed a different name. He built a life in that name. He became, to all external appearances, a different person entirely, a person with no connection to a turquoise van and a summer afternoon in 1973 and a little girl who never made it home. Identity fraud of this kind was considerably easier in the 1970s than it would be today. The digital infrastructure that now connects virtually every aspect of a person's official existence, driver's licenses, social security records, credit histories, employment records, all of it linked and searchable and cross-referenced, simply did not exist in the way it does today. In the early 1970s, a determined person with some resourcefulness and some patience could construct a workable false identity without extraordinary difficulty. The social security number of a deceased infant, used by someone of appropriate age and background, could provide a foundation. Supporting documents, driver's licenses, birth certificates, and the other paper artifacts of official existence, could be obtained or fabricated. And once a person had established themselves in a new location under a new name, the absence of real-time information sharing between jurisdictions meant that the gap between who they claimed to be and who they actually were might never be detected. Gary Ramirez exploited this. He exploited the informational isolation of pre-digital America to make himself into someone else, and he maintained that fiction for the better part of 5 decades. But here is what he did not account for, and could not have accounted for, because the technology did not exist when he made his initial calculation. He did not account for the information encoded in his own cells. He did not account for the fact that his DNA, the microscopic record of his biological identity, would persist in the evidence collected from the scene of his crime long after every other lead had gone cold. He did not account for the possibility that science would eventually develop the means to extract from that biological record not just a profile but a family history, a genetic genealogy, a trail of biological relationships that would lead investigators, step by patient step, from the evidence to his relatives to him. He knew how to change his name. He knew how to change his address. He knew how to change his story. He did not know how to change his DNA. And that is where his calculation failed. That is the gap through which justice eventually found him, not through any of the identity documents he had so carefully constructed, not through any of the social and professional relationships he had built under his assumed name, but through the biological reality of who he was that no effort of concealment could alter. This is, in a sense, the defining lesson of genetic genealogy as an investigative tool. It operates at a level of identity that is deeper than any document, any assumed name, any constructed narrative. It reaches past the person someone claims to be and finds the person they actually are. It finds the biological reality underneath the fiction, and it does so with a precision and a certainty that eyewitness memory and document analysis and conventional investigative techniques simply cannot match. Gary Ramirez thought he had escaped. He thought the distance of decades and miles and an assumed identity was enough. He lived for 48 years in the belief that he had successfully made himself unreachable. He was wrong. He was always going to be wrong, even though neither he nor anyone else could have known that in 1973. The science that would catch him was still decades away from existing. But it was coming. It was always, in some sense, coming. And when it arrived, it found him exactly where he thought he was safest, hidden inside someone else's name in another state, invisible to everyone except the molecules of his own biology. There are people whose lives are defined by waiting for something that may never come. Parents of murdered children often become those people. They wait for an arrest that may or may not happen. They wait for a trial that may or may not follow. They wait for a conviction that may or may not be delivered. And they wait for something beyond all of that, something harder to name and impossible to legislate, which is the sense that what was done to their child has been fully seen, fully acknowledged, fully responded to by the world. That last thing rarely comes. The world moves on. Communities heal, or approximate healing. The media moves to the next story. The years pass and the grief does not diminish so much as it becomes incorporated, becomes part of the structure of a person's daily existence, becomes the invisible weight they carry everywhere they go for the rest of their lives. Barbara O'Keefe carried that weight. She carried it through the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s and the early years of the 21st century. She carried it through all the milestones that Linda would have had, the years when she would have started high school, when she would have graduated, when she might have gone to college or started a career or fallen in love or had children of her own. Every one of those unmaterialized milestones was another weight added to the accumulation. And she carried it through the years of renewed hope that came with the advent of DNA technology and its progressive application to cold cases. Each new development in forensic science, each announcement that a cold case had been solved using new techniques, must have arrived in her life with a particular mixture of hope and dread, hope that the same might happen for Linda, dread at the possibility that it might not, that the evidence in Linda's case might not be sufficient or viable or that the person responsible might have died before being identified. He had not died. He was found. He was convicted. And Barbara O'Keefe, after 48 years, had an answer. We should not romanticize this. We should not suggest that the arrest and conviction of Gary Ramirez erased the weight Barbara had carried or filled the absence that Linda's death had created. It did neither of those things, and anyone who has experienced the loss of a child to violence will tell you that justice, however real and however necessary, is not the same as healing. The wound does not close. The weight does not lift. The person who was taken is still gone. But something changes. Something shifts. The chapter in which the person responsible for that wound gets to walk around free, gets to live their life without consequence, gets to be invisible to the justice that should have reached them decades earlier, that chapter ends. And the ending of that chapter matters. It matters for the family. It matters for the community. It matters for the memory of the child whose name that chapter was written in. Linda O'Keefe deserved to be remembered. She deserved to be more than a cold case. She deserved to be more than a turquoise van and a morning search and a body in a marsh. She deserved a full accounting of who she was, who took her, and what it cost. She deserved a world that fought for her even when the fight seemed hopeless, even when the decade stretched on and the trail went cold and the man who killed her seemed to have permanently escaped. That fight was waged on her behalf for 48 years by investigators who refused to let her case die, by a family that refused to let her memory fade, and ultimately by a scientific community that kept pushing the boundaries of what was knowable about human identity until the answer to who killed Linda O'Keefe became knowable too. She got that, in the end. Not everything. But that. We are living in an era of extraordinary possibility for cold case investigation. The techniques that solved the Linda O'Keefe case, genetic genealogy built on decades of DNA research and the consumer genomics revolution, are being applied to cold cases across the United States and around the world at an accelerating pace. New arrests are announced regularly. New families receive answers they had almost stopped believing would ever come. New cases that seemed permanently closed are being reopened and resolved. This is not a small thing. This is a fundamental change in the relationship between evidence and time, between crime and accountability, between the hope that justice might eventually be served and the reality of it being served. For most of human history, and well into the modern era, the passage of time was the criminal's friend. Evidence degraded. Witnesses died or forgot. Investigations lost momentum. The further a crime receded into the past, the less likely it became that anyone would be held responsible for it. That relationship has been disrupted. Not destroyed, Many cold cases will never be solved, many perpetrators will die without facing accountability, but genuinely, meaningfully disrupted. The passage of time no longer guarantees escape. The biological evidence left at a crime scene persists in ways that conventional investigative evidence does not, and the science to interrogate that evidence continues to develop. Today's unsolved cases may be solved by techniques that do not yet exist. Tomorrow's forensic breakthroughs may reach back decades to find answers that seem permanently unavailable today. This should matter to everyone who cares about justice. It should matter to the families of victims who have spent decades waiting. It should matter to the investigators who have dedicated careers to cases that have not yet yielded answers. And it should matter, perhaps especially, to anyone who has ever thought that the passage of time had made a crime truly safe from consequences. It has not. It may never again. The turquoise van disappeared into the California landscape in the summer of 1973, and for 48 years it seemed like it had taken every answer with it. But the answers were there. They were encoded in the biology of the man who drove it. They were waiting, in the evidence carefully preserved by investigators who refused to give up, for the science that would eventually know how to read them. The science came. The answers came. And Linda O'Keefe, 11 years old, a child of Corona del Mar who deserved so much more than she got, received something that she and her family had been owed for almost 5 decades. Her story does not have a happy ending. No story that begins the way hers began can have a happy ending. But it has a true ending. A just ending. An ending in which the man who thought he had gotten away did not get away, in which the science he never anticipated undid the escape he thought was permanent, in which the world said, finally and clearly and without ambiguity, that what was done to Linda O'Keefe was wrong and that the person who did it would be made to face that fact. She deserved that. She deserved so much more. But she deserved that. And on behalf of Coldcase Crimelab, and on behalf of everyone who has spent time tonight with her story, we say her name. Linda O'Keefe. 11 years old. Corona del Mar, California. July 6, 1973. Never forgotten. Never let go. Finally answered. If this story moved you, if you believe that Linda O'Keefe's name deserves to be heard and that every victim of an unsolved crime deserves the same fight that was waged on her behalf, then do something right now. Like this video so that more people find this story. Subscribe to Coldcase Crimelab so that you are here when we reopen the next case, because there are more families waiting, more names that need to be said, more stories that deserve the same attention and care that we have brought to Linda's tonight. And share this with someone who needs to hear it, because every share is another voice added to the ones saying that these cases matter, that these victims matter, that the passage of time does not and should not mean the passage of accountability. This is Coldcase Crimelab. We will see you on the next case. And until then, say her name.